Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about superchargers versus turbochargers. As you'll hear, Dick will explain how superchargers and turbochargers are quite different, but their goal is exactly the same. And he threw in some information on a hybrid just for good measure. But before we get to that conversation, I need to take a moment to ask, have you subscribed to or followed the show on your favorite podcast app? Have you shared the show with your fellow F1 fans? If not, can you take a moment to do so now? For an indie podcast like us, that's how we grow. To those who've already done so, the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, Dick, another one of these tech talks. I think this conversation that you have slated for us of superchargers versus turbochargers, like that sounds so like when I read the title, I thought, is that like a superhero? Like I kept thinking of like the Avengers, all that kind of stuff. But I know that that can't be because this is Formula One, which I do hold in high esteem, our drivers. But this is all about the actual car component. And so can you tell me before we get started, superchargers and turbochargers, where is that located when we're looking at the car?
Yeah, so this is a device that sits usually either at the front of an engine, that would be the supercharger, or at the rear of the engine attached to the exhaust pipes, believe it or not, that would be the turbocharger. And they both have, I guess the best way to put it is they have the same function, but they work very differently from each other, and they have advantages and disadvantages over each other. But the basic idea is that you have a series of fans spinning away inside a very tight housing, and at one end the air is coming in and being compressed by these fan blades, and then shot out the back as compressed air into the fuel injection system. So a real easy way to think of it, it's sort of like a jet engine, but at a very, very small level. And of course, there's no, combustion going on inside of them or anything like that. It just spins real fast, like the blades on a jet engine that you see when you get on an airliner. And as the air comes in, it squeezes the air together to the air molecules together, much higher pressure, giving a much, much more denser charge. With the advantage being is that as that air then gets put into the fuel injection system, because there's more air, that means you can throw in more fuel. More air, more fuel equals a bigger bang, and therefore more horsepower.
Okay. I think the thing that helped me visually in my mind was when you said it's like what did you call it again?
Like the jet engine.
The jet engine. And so we're just now seeing it on a much smaller scale. And then depending on if it's a super versus turbo determines where it's going to be positioned in the car.
Right. And they're positioned differently for a very good reason.
Okay. Why don't you tell us why is that and what's the differences between the two?
Right. So the supercharger is the one that sits at the front of the engine, usually, and it's driven by a fan belt that is attached to the crankshaft. This is typical. There's some other variants on it. It could be a chain drive that's attached to the camshaft or the crankshaft. But basically what it is that as the engine turns over, that belt spins those fan blades that then compresses the air and shoves that compressed air into the fuel injection system. The thing that's interesting about that is that because it's attached directly to the crankshaft, when the driver steps on the throttle pedal, the supercharger will turn over at the same speed as the crankshaft. So as the crankshaft accelerates, then the fan inside the supercharger accelerates at the same pace that the crankshaft does. So the advantage to that is that you have instantaneous power. There's no lag or anything like that. The engine just goes because all that power is being delivered to it instantaneously. The disadvantage is that because that supercharger is driven by the engine's crankshaft, it actually consumes power from that engine. And so it is not necessarily like if bolting a supercharger on your engine gives you an extra 200 horsepower, it's probably consuming 20 of that horsepower because it takes a certain amount of energy to spin that supercharger. So really the boost is only 180 horsepower, okay, if that makes sense. The other thing is that superchargers can be fairly heavy for whatever reason. And typically in a racing application, you would find them on dragsters because of that near instantaneous power. The moment the driver steps on it, he's got the full power of the turbo of the supercharger. And what's interesting is that really during the end of World War I believe it was, as airplanes started flying higher and higher, these airplanes needed some way, as the air got thinner, right? They needed to be able to produce more power because they were dogfighting. And so what they did is some clever guy came up with the idea of the supercharger and attached it to the engine so that they could fly the airplane higher and still produce a whole bunch of power. So that's where it really first showed up. And then in the 1920s, supercharged race cars became more and more common.
Okay. That's okay. I really appreciate how you're giving us the analogy to planes, because that helps to have a different, because I feel like we can see it in a different way because we interact with planes a little bit more. I would assume most of our listeners do as well. Because especially when you talk about the dog fighting, and then because in my brain I think of Orville and Wilbur Wright, and their plane would not be really able to do any kind of dog fighting. But then when we get to the war, and then the need to continue innovating and doing, as you said, go higher and do those dog fighting would push the envelope of innovation and find this. Okay, that helps a lot. Okay, but here's a thing. I didn't want to interrupt you because you were on such a good roll. What is the crankshaft? I know I probably should know this, but there's got to be somebody else out there like me who doesn't.
That's okay. So the crankshaft is basically a piece of typically forged steel that sits down in the bottom of the engine called the crankcase, and it is attached to connecting rods that connect to the pistons that are going up and down. And basically, the job of the crankshaft is to convert the up and down motion of the pistons going up and down in their cylinders and convert that into a rotational motion. And so they're taking all of that energy, the crankshaft takes all of that energy that is being produced by the pistons going up and down in their cylinder bores, and converts that to a rotational force that can then be taken through the transmission into the differential, and then eventually out to the rear tires. And that gets put down as horsepower then onto the ground.
I know that there's so many components and they all interconnect and they all have such value. It's hard for a person like me who isn't really been inside of that technological engineering background to even wrap my brain around all these different pieces. Because then when you started talking about that, I was like, well, a piston. And then I had all these other questions, which will have to be other tech series conversations, because I do not want to divert you from the other side of the conversation. If we said supercharger, then there's the turbocharger. So I'm writing my note to ask you about pistons later, but you gave me my direct answer, which was for the crankshaft. So turbochargers, they're a compressor as well of this air.
Correct. And it's really easy to think of a turbocharger. You remember as a kid, you probably played with a pinwheel, right? And it had it was kind of like a little fan that had a little bit of a shaft going through the middle of it, and you would hold it with a stick and you could blow on it, and that pinwheel would then spin, right? So they take that same idea, think about a pinwheel that instead of sitting on something that just allows it to spin, it's actually connected to a shaft that's connected to another pinwheel. And so you blow on one pinwheel and lo and behold, that shaft spins and it spins the other pinwheel. And I think maybe that's the best way way to think of it. And so the jet engine works exactly the same way, in that the one of the pinwheels actually has exhaust blowing on it. And as that exhaust blows on the pinwheel spins, which, because it's connected to a drive shaft, basically, the drive shaft is also connected to another pinwheel, or in this case, compressor, that draws fresh air in, compresses it, and then shoots it out into the fuel injection system, just like the supercharger would do. So the turbocharger, instead of being connected to a rotating component of an engine, in this case, the crankshaft, what we're doing here is we're actually taking the rush of exhaust gas that is coming out of the exhaust pipes, and the exhaust pipes, instead of going straight out into the air, they actually go into the turbocharger and spin that pinwheel to then spin up the compressor. Now, the advantage to that is that it's free energy. You're not dragging the engine down by having that compressor attached to the crankshaft, but rather it's just using the free heat energy that the engine has already produced anyway. And so it's a very efficient, very effective way of spooling up that turbocharger. The problem is that when the driver goes, let's say the engine is almost at idle, when the driver steps on the gas pedal, the engine speeds up with very little turbocharger effect until it gets up to a certain point, and there's enough exhaust gas rushing in on that pinwheel that the turbocharger then spools up and starts shoving in that extra air into the fuel injection system, and bang, here's the power, and off you go. That lag is called turbo lag, and even today, race cars have it. It used to be really pronounced in the late 1970s when they first started really working with turbocharged engines. But nowadays, a lot of that lag has been reduced through, a lot of clever technology that they're using these days to keep that turbine compressor spinning at a fairly high rate so that the dense air is rushing in.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say when it comes to this disadvantage is that the press of the throttle and there results in this turbo lag. Is that because it actually is needing to take the left, like in my mind, I keep thinking of leftover, like the residual of the air that you just said.
Of the exhaust gas. Yep.
Of the exhaust gas, right?
Yep.
So that action needs to create that exhaust gas. Is that what when you say this lag? So it needs that action to result for it to then capture it and then move it forward. And so the cleverness comes in is as I was listening, I was thinking, this is so clever to use something that is technically waste, but to repackage it or harness it to use it to your advantage.
Exactly.
And even in that process, you're not, even if you're losing a little bit of energy, you're actually gaining in the overall. Unlike with the supercharger, you would lose some and you're not. This is actually the overall outcome is going to get you much better despite the lag, because up now in 2024, when we're recording this, the ability to harness and minimize that loss and that lag has been reduced dramatically through cleverness. Is that a good restatement of what you said?
Yep. One of the things that, drivers have to cope with it, like they may step on the gas pedal a little bit early because they know that the engine has to catch up to where they want the power. And so, if the engine was not turbocharged, they'd have instantaneous power, right? And so they would start putting the gas pedals down sooner with a turbocharged engine than they would want to with an engine that did not have a turbocharger, basically, to take care of that lag. Now, if you listen to what Ayrton Senna did with the throttle on the turbocharged McLaren that he drove, you can hear him going through a corner and the engine's going wah, 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 wah. And then all of a sudden, wah, and he's slamming the throttle down. Well, the kind of the blipping of the engine, the wah, 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 like that, what he was doing was he was keeping the turbocharger spooled up. So when he needed that power, it was right there.
Oh, wow. That's so clever.
Yeah. So that's the part of the genius of Senna.
because that goes back to what you said about the pinwheels. It's like keeping them rotating instead of allowing them to just slow down. And so by doing that, and that goes back to knowing the car, feeling the level of confidence in what the limit that you can do, and your own talent. And that's all happening in, like, I guess that's not even something a driver of that elite level necessarily at that point is thinking about as much as they're feeling it, like their oneness with the car. And their skill has been developed to that point that they can just feel that ever so slight. You and I know John sent us an excellent video about the McLaren MP44. And the designer of it in the video talked about how Senna could tell if something was cranked down to like a quarter of an inch, and that was how astute, sensitive he was. And I thought to myself, wow, that's kind of amazing. So now to hear it in this context and to realize that ever so slight adjustment can have amplified effect on your ability to harness every element of that car. And that's just on this turbo side, this turbocharger. It's not even the other elements of the car that he or other drivers are capable of harnessing. Wow. Okay. I had a question and it all of a sudden went out of my head as I was restating this to you.
Well, I have a somewhat funny story while you're thinking about it.
Okay.
So I was running a driver who was very, very quick in, what's called a Formula 2000 car, single seat, open wheel car with a 2-liter engine in it. And he was very quick, but he could never tell you why he was quick. And finally we were, trying to debrief him and get him to tell us what the car was doing and all that. And he goes, guys, I'm really sorry. I'm just not very well connected with this car. And the guy that I was with who was debriefing him, who, by the way, trains astronauts for a living to fly the new Artemis moonship, he looks at me, he says, I tell you what, I'm going to get the ball off of a trailer hitch. I'm going to stick it in the bottom of your seat. And let's see if you're connected then.
That is funny. I mean, but that is what I think that we as non-racers don't maybe fully appreciate, the level of closeness that all of this is happening from the engineer to the designer to the driver to the mechanics who are setting it up, all of it. It's just as I have these conversations with the both of you, I always walk away more amazed, because when you initially come in and you're just looking at it simply from a race, like who's going first, who's going second, it's quite remarkable. But when you realize the in-depth components and all the different elements that are being adjusted and designed, and how it goes back to what you said a few conversations back in a monthly race review, of how one change as you're doing the development race, how it can lead to a myriad of consequences that you may or may not have intended, and it can lead a team down. And so listening to you, this was my question. Sounds like even developing a turbocharger, it would require you would see differences between each team, and this goes back to the development race, is how well they understand this and all the other components related to the power unit.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, and this is when we hear about decisions of teams to change power units. The implications are pretty dramatic, because it could have an effect not just on the relationship between the two companies, but actually what they've always been dealing with when they understand the power unit itself, and then how this turbocharger. So like it would be like transplants in a human body. Like all of a sudden, if you got a new heart, your body has to adjust to all of that, and it could reject or it could accept it, and it needs that time. I got us off a little bit off track by getting a little esoteric about it, but this is so cool to me. All right, so what else do you think we need to know about the turbocharger?
And this goes to a little bit around the whole hybrid program. Turbochargers are what's used in Formula One. And so, when they came out with the original rules package where they went hybrid in, I think it was 2014, they actually ran two different means of harvesting energy to then go in and charge up a battery that could then be used for additional horsepower. And one of those is called an motor generator motor generator unit kinetic, or an MGU-K. And basically what that is it's a generator that recovers energy when the car is braking. And it basically generates electricity, charges a battery that's located in the car. And then when the driver says, yep, I want to go and release this energy, he pushes a button, and that electrical energy then goes and spools up an electric motor that gives them another 150 horsepower. Now, that is still in use today. But at the same time, back in 2014, they also came out with something called the Motor Generator Unit Heat, or the MGU-H, which is an incredibly complicated deal. But basically what it did was it attached itself to the engine's turbocharger and basically was used to spin a generator that would produce electrical power and then charge the battery pack. And then again, once the battery pack was charged up along with the MGU-K, then the drivers could release that energy into the electric motors and the hybrid system and get that extra jolt of 150 horsepower or thereabouts. The MGU-H was disbanded, as I understand it, for the 22 season when there was the regulation change. And the reason they did it was just horrifically expensive and the manufacturers were wanting to do away with it. However, there's a chance that it may show itself again in future regulations, but for right now, it's not.
This is part of the more hybrid aspect
Correct.
of what we're seeing now
Correct.
on the grid. This isn't something that we would have seen during the time of Senna and
No.
or in the 80s, 90s, or any of that.
And the point that I'm trying to make is that MGU-H, where it's relevant is because it is consuming power off of the turbocharger. It's sort of like, you talked about free horsepower because of using exhaust gases, right? Something that's already been consumed to spool up a turbocharger, which then would produce more horsepower. Well, here they were doing it not only for the internal combustion engine and cramming more air and fuel into that little engine, it was also spooling up a generator to produce more electricity, to recharge a battery pack, to then run an electric motor, and therefore put more horsepower on the ground. So the turbocharger in that formula, that specification, it was doing two things, not one.
So then let me ask you this, because when you said generator, it made me think about the car's weight. Is this part of the reason why the cars of today are so much larger than in the past?
Yeah. I mean, you've got to package a battery. You got to package the extra engines, all those kinds of things. And of course, that's part of it. And then of course, just because the regulations changed and you're going to a ground effect car, it's going to be a somewhat bigger car just by nature.
Right. There's like no way around that because of the fixed aspect of it. So I've got now a lot of questions I'll pose to you offline, or our listeners can definitely ask questions and I'll pose it back. And we may have to do follow-up conversations because I think that there are other elements of the tech series that will connect to this. But this helps us a lot in understanding when I know people have said like that's a turbo and I'm going, okay, what is that? I don't really quite understand. So this helps me to understand how the ingenuity of the Formula One process, let me ask you this question before we go. Any of this that we just discussed, do we see these on road cars?
Yes.
Okay. Where would we see this on a road car?
Obviously some performance cars are going to have turbos. But you can buy a Ford F-150 pickup. So it's a half-ton pickup with a V6 engine, not a V8 like you'd normally expect, a pickup truck to come with. And that V6 has a turbocharger. And the reason that they're doing that is that if you're towing a load or whatever, you're going to need more horsepower. And so that turbocharger comes in and provides you with that power that you need to tow that heavy load. But if you're just tooling around town, you don't need a V8 burning a whole bunch of extra gasoline. So put a smaller engine in there and you get somewhat the best of both worlds. You get the big horsepower when you need it, but when you don't need the big horsepower, you get good fuel economy.
Nice. I think that's really helpful for us to understand where these innovations, where it may have direct application to our lives. That, I think that's something that often in this conversation about sustainability that people have and question, those of us who we see the value or we enjoy motor racing, they may not fully grasp where this type of stuff does actually benefit the overall landscape when it comes to the innovation. Okay, Dick, you did a great job. I appreciate you for trying to make this as simple as possible for those of us who are not racers and not STEM people, and make this very approachable. So I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.